Hello, students. I'm Dr. Ellen Block. Thank you so much for reading my book, Infected Kin. I've been sent a bunch of questions, about 175 of them. I wish I could answer them all, but I've picked some that I think kind of group together the big ideas that the book addresses and the big ideas that you all had in your questions for me. So I want to start with the question, did you run into any barriers while collecting data? Um, of course, and all anthropologists do. One of the challenges of working in rural Lesotho is that it's really hard to get to people's homes and it's hard to communicate with them beforehand. So I would often, ride my motorcycle out to their house, hike for a few hours, and they wouldn't be there. But so I could have, for example, I could have decided to interview only people when they came into the hospital, but then I'm going to miss the most rural, remote people. And then I'm not really going to understand the challenges of living in this very remote rural area and caring for a child or a child who has HIV. Um, Another barrier that I think any good anthropologist struggles with is kind of this idea of reflexivity of thinking about your own position in relation to the people you're studying. And, it would be easy to kind of ignore those or kind of just bowl them over, I guess. But, if I understand there's a power differential between me and the people I'm studying, and I can ask them if they're willing to participate in my study, and they might say yes, but not mean it. And so I have to be really attentive to picking up on things that they might be, if they're reluctantly answering questions, or make sure that they understand that it's not required for them to participate. So the next question I'm going to answer is, how did you know what you wanted to choose to include in your research? I had like thousands of, I don't know, thousands of, but probably 1,000 pages of data at least that I didn't include in the book because nobody wants to read that much, right? So, but what you do when you're analyzing qualitative data is you kind of look at all of it, you code it for themes, and then there's some really interesting sort of side points that I don't really get to in the book. Um, but the things that were really obvious to me that really stood out or really powerful stories, those are the ones that I included. So certainly there were some things that I would have liked to include, but the data should speak for itself. And in this case, it really did. Like the findings that I present are so obvious after being there for a long time that I knew which kind of stories I wanted to tell or which points I wanted to make, and then kind of had the stories that matched those that gave good examples of that larger point that you read about in the book. One of you asked, do you still keep in touch with the people you write about? So yes, I was that last year in 2015, and I was supposed to be going back in this year, but that is not happening for obvious reasons. But hopefully next year I'll be able to go back and visit. But also, there's a foundation that raises money for the NGO that I worked with, MCS. And so I'm the executive director of that foundation. And every year I raise about $250,000 through fundraisers and campaigns and all these different things to support the work that they're doing with kids in Mokhotlong. And then May and Tabby Sang and her son are still very close to our family, and we try to see them about once a year. They'll come here or we go there. So yeah, very, very close with the organization and the people there as well. Um, One of you asked, you often talk about the personal connections you formed with the children at MCS. Was it emotional for you when those children left to live with their family? Were you scared for their health and well-being? So I wanted to answer this question because like it's really easy to think, these kids are going to go back to a home where maybe at first nobody in the family wanted them, or maybe, they were very sick and they left the care of their mother or grandmother or whatever it is. Um, and it would be easy to think like, yeah, they're going back to live in poverty. Wouldn't it be better if I could adopt them or something like that, right? I mean, if they could live with a wealthy family, or if they could move to be adopted internationally and get a good education and that sort of thing. But the kind of underlying idea there is that like all poor kids would be better off with non-poor families. And so that's just not ethical or doable, or, there's a lot of issues with that. So for me, I to me, MCS is working if all the kids end up back with their families. So when a kid, of course, I got attached to these kids that I would live with for 6 months, and play with every day. But to me, it was always a celebration to them going back to their families because, it meant that they were stable and healthy enough to do that. And it also meant that they, had someone who was willing to take them. There was a few cases where I felt like they were going back to a family member that wasn't going to be able to take care of them. One child that I write about in the book in particular, whose grandmother stopped giving him his ARVs, and we couldn't find them or their record of them taking their ARVs. And I have to assume that that kid that I lived with for many months has passed away, because he couldn't survive without taking his drugs. And of course, those situations are heartbreaking. But for the most part, it was sad to see my friends leave, but it was more a feeling of extreme kind of celebration and happiness that they had somewhere to go. So here's a couple questions regarding stigma. The first one is, I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. The first one is, have you noticed a shift in the stigma surrounding AIDS? Like it's shameful, blaming mothers. And then the second one is, if there was a decrease in stigma associated with HIV/AIDS, meaning, the sort of idea of promiscuity and that people are stigmatized because it is assumed that their promiscuous behavior led to their HIV infection, would people seek better treatment? And when I started going to Lesotho in 2007, ARVs were only just recently available. These are antiretroviral drugs, the drugs you need to survive with HIV. They were only available in the rural clinics, like just starting to be available. So at that time, people were just starting to see the transformative power of these medications that saved lives, and that, everybody knows someone who went from looking like skeletal and extremely, extremely sick with sores on their bodies and all these sort of visible hair loss, like it's a very sort of painful and visible decline, to looking like a healthy person. People often point to, for example, fatness. So they praise someone who's plump because it means they can't possibly be sick. That's like a real sign of health. Because wasting or becoming very, very emaciated is a sign of HIV and tuberculosis as well. And so everybody saw that transformation happen when drugs became available. And the more those drugs were available, the more people witnessed that transformation. And I think that went the furthest way to reducing the stigma. So the second question was about if people would seek better treatment. And there's this interesting sort of feedback loop. People saw that when people sought treatment, they got better, and therefore more people sought treatment, and therefore stigma reduced. So there's kind of this like looping effect. And so now I would say, I mean, there certainly is still stigma, and people aren't very good at communicating about, their sexual partners or their HIV status with even their spouses. But as you can understand, that would be a really challenging conversation. But people go in and get the treatment for the most part now because they know it's going to save their lives. They've seen it happen time and time again. They know so many people who have done it. And then in turn, that decreases people's viral load, makes them less likely to pass it on to a sexual partner or to a child in utero or during breastfeeding in the mother to child transmission. And therefore, the overall HIV rates have decreased of new infections. The prevalence rate is the same, but that's because people are living for a long time with HIV rather than dying and new people getting infected. So there is good news on that front. Excuse me, I have some allergies, so excuse the sniffling. The next question is, how do you think stigma around HIV will affect these children's lives in the future? That's a really interesting question because these kids that I met in 2007 when they were very young and, kids were starting to sort of survive with HIV as ARVs were becoming available, they are now coming of age, like they're reaching puberty, they're themselves becoming sexually active. And I think it's like, it's one thing to contract HIV when you're a young person, a teenager or a young adult, and deal with those challenges. And lots of people have been thinking about that. But to grow up having HIV the whole time and then hit puberty and start to be interested in sex and that sort of thing, that's going to be a whole new challenge. First of all, because of like, we don't know how well children in the global south will do with the treatments that are available if they have HIV their whole lives, right? But we also, I think it's challenging because Lesotho isn't a society that talks very openly about sexuality or health. I mean, they have sex ed in schools and stuff, but families aren't really sitting their kids down being like, hey, you have HIV. This is what that means for you. Here are the kinds of things you can do with your sexual partners, and here's where you have to be more careful. And viral load makes a lot of difference in this and that sort of thing. So I think that's going to be a real challenge, and also stigmatizing, because people might say like, oh, don't date that person, they have HIV. Um, so I don't know the answer to that, and that's something I'd like to keep thinking about. So the next question is, what will be the most difficult barrier that must be overcome as grandmother caregivers become incapacitated or die? Yeah, I mean, I think the most challenging thing would be to find caregivers for very young children, because like I talk about in the book, grandmothers are viewed as like mothers, so they take on that responsibility without it feeling like an undue burden, and they're also not young and having their own children or going out to work. I think one thing that's kind of mitigating that is, like I mentioned just a minute ago, that lowered new infection rate, and people are living longer with HIV. So fewer kids are being orphaned because of HIV, because their mothers might contract HIV. The prevalence rate is still very high. They're probably living with someone with HIV, but that person is still able to work, is healthy enough, is, able to stay alive to take care of them until they can take care of themselves. So, but I still think that's an ongoing concern. And, with COVID happening in Lesotho, with many years of drought, thankfully in the last few weeks they've gotten really good rain. So I'm hopeful for the crops for next year. But for this year, there's bound to be a lot of malnutrition and other challenges that people are having. Um, but grandmothers have always been a really important safety net, and hopefully they can continue to do that. The next question is, in the absence of AIDS, what would family structures in Lesotho look like? And then in the next question, someone said, if the epidemic is brought under control, do you see these more flexible notions of lineality increasing or reverting back to how they were before the epidemic? So I'm going to answer those two questions together. So the first part, what would families look like without AIDS? I mean, that's sort of hard to imagine, I suppose. But the thing about families is they never look like what they're supposed to look like. I mean, that's kind of one of the underlying messages, is there people have an ideal about what does the Basutu family look like. It's patrilineal. They should have patrilocal care. So when a child needs care for whatever reason, migrant labor, orphanhood, the father's family, if they're married and bride wealth is paid, should go live there. But those things were already changing because of these, decades of I mean, really more like a century almost, or half a century of migrant labor to South Africa. And so I think the family would look like it would have a lot fewer orphans, but it might not have that many fewer people living with their grandmothers and their great aunts and that sort of thing, because if their parents were alive, they might be migrating for work. So you'd see a lot of child circulation or movement between households like you do now. Um, and you would see a lot of that caregiving, but it wouldn't be the crisis that it is because of AIDS. So it wouldn't be people doing it even when they physically don't really have the means to do it, like very old grandmothers or people who aren't ambulatory, or can't, can't walk around very well and that sort of thing. And the kids themselves would be healthy, and that puts a huge strain on people. So I think you would still see a lot of blended families, because that's always been the case. I think you would see a lot of, and leads into the second part of that question that I read, which is this sort of when people lose these flexible notions of lineality. And I think the point is that they're always flexible, because the ideal is never like, we don't live in these like perfect cultural vacuums. There's all these outside factors influencing us. So what would COVID do to it? What would this malnutrition, what would this drought do to it? Would people have to go work so they more out of Lesotho so they could send food back to their families and that sort of thing? So I think those are really interesting questions to think about together.